Hello everybody, we want to thank you all for joining us in our next master event. Now, let's give the warmest welcome to Alexander Leicht, Chief of the Section of Education for Sustainable Development at UNESCO, who will be sharing with us the keynote lecture, Opportunities and Challenges of Implementing Education for Sustainable Development in Universities. But first, let's take a look at his profile video.
Alexander Leicht is Chief of the Section of Education for Sustainable Development, ESD, at UNESCO. Before joining UNESCO, he was head of the German Secretariat for the UN Decade of ESD at the German Commission for UNESCO from 2004 to 2011. He also worked 3 years as a university teacher in Hungary and the United Kingdom, and was originally trained as a teacher at the University of Marburg, Germany, and at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, USA. He holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Nottingham, United Kingdom. As Chief of the Section at ESD, his current priorities include launching and implementing the new UNESCO framework, ESD for 2030. Which aims at mobilizing ESD to make progress towards all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, his portfolio includes the global monitoring of Target 4.7 of Sustainable Development Goal 4 on education. From 2016 to 2018, he also led UNESCO's work on global citizenship education, in addition to ESD, and in 2018 spent 3 months as officer in charge of the UNESCO office in Tehran. He has published on ESD, sustainable development, global citizenship education, cultural policy, and American studies. We are very pleased to be connected with you today. Welcome, Alexander Leicht.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very, very exciting event. I'm very pleased to share today a couple of thoughts from the UNESCO perspective, a couple of explanation, a couple of thoughts on education for sustainable development, this particular educational approach that we, with many partners together, are promoting. As you know, UNESCO is among the United Nations agencies, is the agency that has a big mandate on education, and is among the United Nations agencies, the recognized lead agency on education for sustainable development. So we are coordinating the global work on ESD. What I'll do today, what I would like to do today, I would like first to speak generally about our approach to education for sustainable development, our understanding of education for sustainable development, where this approach came from and where it is positioned at the moment. I will do that at the level of the global discussions that have been taken place. I will secondly look then at a new framework that our UNESCO member states have approved, and the framework that we are promoting, and that is basically providing the strategy for the coming 10 years for us in the work on education for sustainable development. We call it the ESD for 2030 framework. Then I will briefly pause to look at a number of achievements this year, because this year was a year really of renewed commitments for strengthening an educational response, in particular to climate change, but also to other sustainable development challenges. And I will then talk about the implementation of education for sustainable development, and also specifically speak about the role of higher education and what education for sustainable development means or can mean for higher education, the role higher education has in promoting generally the sustainable development agenda. So I'm starting with just a very general reminder of really the dramatic global challenges that we are all facing, and within which all our educational work, be it at universities, be it at secondary schools, or in other parts of the education system, is situated. You can see here some data from the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And a report that came out this year in August, and that really highlights again really the dramatic scientific facts, but basically that we are confronting with regard to climate change. So we have the fastest rates of sea level rise in the last 3,000 years. We have the lowest level of Arctic sea ice in 1,000 years. We have retreating glaciers. We have, of course, as we all know, increasing CO2 concentration, all of which human induced, all of which induced by the way basically we live and we run our economies. And this general context that we are seeing is something within which education has to position itself. For many years, I think for a long time, education has really not properly taken into account these wider global challenges, has really occupied itself with very important things like skills development, like enhancing literacy and numeracy, everything very valuable and continues to be valuable, but has not sufficiently really responded to the big global challenges that we are seeing. And this big response to the global challenges that we are seeing is provided by education for sustainable development and other related approaches like education for global citizenship or also environmental education. So when we look at where education for sustainable development comes from, and like this, trying to narrow down to what it means for us, how can we define it, we need to look at basically two converging processes in the global processes that have happened in the global discussions, in the global policy discussions, but also in the national policy discussions over the last couple of years, maybe let's say over the last 10, 15 years. We have on the one hand, we have the education discourse, what is happening in education, and we have an increasing awareness that sustainable development topics, content needs to be integrated into education. And we have the sustainable development discourse, for example, stakeholders at the national level, like environment ministries that try to respond to climate change and other sustainable development challenges. And these stakeholders have increasingly realized how important it is to mobilize education to achieve their sustainable development goals. This is spelled out here. You can see on this slide a bit more detail on this move to integrate sustainable development issues, sustainable development content into education. When we look back at the global education agenda in the 1990s and early 2000s, for example, the World Declaration on Education for All in Yomtien in 1990, the big Dakar framework for action on education for all, and then the Millennium Development Goals, of course, that defined global development work from 2000 to 2015. And we can see that education was really very much focused on access to education. Education work was very much focused on getting people into schools, getting people into universities, with a limited attention to the quality of education. When there was attention to the quality of education, it was a lot around basic skills. Separately from this, from all these discussions, we had the emergence of education for sustainable development through the United Nations Decade on Education for Sustainable Development, a global 10-year campaign, basically, that UNESCO ran together with partners. We had a big world conference in Bonn in 2009, where a link was provided between quality education and education that is needed for sustainable development. But we have to say that this ESD agenda was rather separate from the Millennium Development Goals and from the big framing of education discourse at the national levels and at the global level. And then we have moved towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And here we see really that education and education for sustainable development is really finally fully integrated into the education discourse. It's not seen anymore like an add-on or like a kind of nice to have addition. Here you can see on this slide the second trend that I tried to outline, that I tried to mention on this first slide with the two arrows that you saw, and these are various sustainable development processes: the response to climate change in the Paris Agreement, the Man and the Biosphere strategy of UNESCO, the big United Nations decade on ecosystems restoration and on the ocean sciences. And in all these processes, we can see an increasing awareness that education is an important instrument to achieve sustainable development, to address very specific sustainable development issues. So we have, on the one hand, the education discourse. Sustainable development moved into that discourse. We have the sustainable development discourse. Education increasingly moved into that discourse. And that culminates in a certain way in the concept of ESD, of understanding education as a key for the achievement of all the sustainable development goals, all the 17 United Nations sustainable development goals that are currently really our global framework for achieving sustainable development. And you can see here one important kind of quote that really brings together education and sustainable development, and it calls here ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, an integral element of the Sustainable Development Goal on quality education and a key enabler of all the other sustainable development goals. Like here we see basically these two processes converging in the concept of education for sustainable development goal. This is encapsulated in Sustainable Development Goal 4 and Target 7 of that goal, that really specifically recognizes education for sustainable development and makes it fully part of the global education agenda, and indeed of the really commitment of countries, of stakeholders within countries to drive this work forward, to further integrate sustainable development issues into education. So when we move now towards a kind of definition that we use at UNESCO together with other stakeholders on what education for sustainable development means for us, we need to say that it empowers learners of all ages with the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to address the interconnected global challenges we face. What is very important here, what I want to point out, is that we are really not speaking only about knowledge, but we're really speaking about the whole range of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. Providing knowledge alone about the specific sustainable development challenge will not lead to other action, will not lead to action if not the relevant skills, values, and attitudes are also provided through education. That's why we also emphasize very much the importance of the equal importance of the three learning dimensions of the cognitive learning, of social emotional learning, and of behavioral learning. So we have with the cognitive, we have the relevant content, social emotional learning, the certain dispositions to act, the motivation to act, the possibility also to the capacity also to empathize with others who are maybe suffering from unsustainable development, and then finally really the behavioral learning dimension with action competencies that are the ultimate goal of education for sustainable development, really leading to real life action and to a better promotion of sustainable development at the local level and at the global level. So this also means that education must be transformative and must enable us to make informed choices and take individual and collective action to change our societies and care for the planet. So really the emphasis very much about an education that does not only work at the individual level, gives me skills for my career, so to speak, but really that makes a societal contribution very specifically to the environmental and sustainable development challenges that we are facing. Where do we stand on education for sustainable development? One of the work streams we undertake at UNESCO is really checking global progress, collecting and analyzing data, trying to find out where we stand as a global community on the issue of mobilizing education to addressing sustainable development. I brought here some very recent data that we presented at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, COP26. We reviewed national curriculum frameworks of 100 countries, and we found that roughly half of all these documents have no reference to climate change at all. We undertook this analysis for climate change, but the picture looks similar for other sustainable development challenges. But this particular research was focused here on climate change. So 47% of the documents have no reference to climate change. Climate change is not present in the national curriculum frameworks in those countries. And then the other 53% where it does appear, in most of those countries, the depth of integration of climate change into teaching and learning is very low. So we can see some notional references to climate change, but certainly not the really holistic, the necessary holistic education response to climate change that we would like to see, basically. Another important data that we presented in this report and that we found in our research is that when we compare countries, we can see that there are more climate change education references in countries vulnerable to climate change as opposed to those largely responsible for the emissions causing climate change. So there's also a very big disconnect between those countries basically that are suffering from climate change and that do take the mobilization of education to addressing climate change more seriously than those countries that actually are causing climate change, which of course points also very much to a big global and environmental justice issue, and there's this disconnect between sort of those who suffer from climate change and those who are causing climate change. We see similar data from a recent teacher survey we did. It was secondary school teachers, but I'm pretty confident, and we would have to run it, of course, that research also for university teachers. It would be interesting to see, but I would guess that the results would maybe not be so different. We surveyed almost 60,000 teachers from 144 countries, and we found out that yes, climate change and other sustainable development issues are important to teachers. Nearly 95% of the teachers believed that it is important or very important to teach about climate change in schools and classrooms. But then fewer than 40% of the teachers were confident in teaching it and said they do not receive the necessary support from the ministry, from the school leadership, from other entities that would be able to provide support to teaching and learning about climate change. Only about a third of the teachers felt able to explain well the effects of climate change on their locality. And about 40% of teachers are confident in teaching the cognitive dimension of climate change, but not the other dimensions. And as I mentioned earlier, teaching the cognitive dimension, sort of understanding the facts of climate change, is certainly an important step, but it's certainly not enough to really generate change towards more sustainable lifestyles, which is, of course, one of the objectives of education for sustainable development. And accordingly, only about 20% of the surveyed teachers can explain well how to take action, which kind of confirms the previous findings. So as I said, this was a survey done with secondary school teachers, and we would have to run a similar survey for university. But I would imagine that despite the very large amount of good practices on sustainability that are happening in universities, there's still a lot of need also for additional support and for empowering university teachers really across all departments and not only in very specific departments that explicitly focus on climate change to addressing climate change. This leads me to this new framework that we have launched, this new global strategy that our member states, that the countries that come together under the UNESCO umbrella have worked out and have launched this year. with the overall goal to build a more just and sustainable world through strengthening education for sustainable development and contributing to the achievement of the 17 SDGs, and more specifically to fully integrate sustainability and the 17 SDGs into policies, learning environments, capacity building of educators, the empowerment of mobilization of young people, and then local level action. So this is really providing a roadmap, a mutually agreed roadmap for member states, for the global community, and we of course are very happy if other stakeholders from different levels of the education system join this roadmap and the implementation of this roadmap. The main emphasis really in this roadmap is education's role for the 17 SDGs, and very more specifically the approach that education for sustainable development can raise the awareness of the importance of the 17 sustainable development goals in education settings, even without necessarily always speaking about one or the other SDG explicitly. Secondly, in line with what I've said earlier, ESD mobilizes action towards the achievement of the SDGs through communication and advocacy in educational settings. And then also ESD, we see ESD very well positioned to promote a critical and contextualized understanding of the SDGs by raising questions of the interlinkages and tensions among different SDGs. Because, of course, education for sustainable development promotes critical thinking, promotes the understanding of complexities, promotes the taking of decisions in light of uncertainties, and all these key competencies of education for sustainable development can help deal with the relationships, interlinkages, but also with the trade-offs and tensions between the different sustainable development goals that have been approved. In addition to sort of the positioning towards education as an achiever of the SDGs, or complementing this positioning, we can see this new framework, this new roadmap, emphasizing very much the big transformation that is needed in all aspects of society, and the need for education to really be mobilized to addressing this big transformation. At the individual level, of course, every individual through education should become a change agent for sustainable development, but then also going beyond the individual level, really looking at the level of the society, looking at the level of the economy, and at all the changes that are needed there to achieve, for example, carbon neutrality and other ways of sustainable development. And what does it mean for education to contribute to these goals? And how can education, what kind of skills, what kind of values, attitudes, and knowledge needs to be promoted to achieve this kind of transformation of the economy, transformation of society. In this framework, we have in particular identified 5 action areas that we see as crucial for moving forward education for sustainable development, really at the global level, at the national level, but also at the level of the education institution. These 5 action areas, these 5 priority action areas, are on the one hand advancing policy, integrating education for sustainable development into education policies in order to provide a really enabling policy environment for the sustainability work in education institutions on the ground. That leads me to the second priority action area, which is about transforming learning environments, which looks at the individual education institution and promotes a reorientation, sort of a change or a transformation of this education institution towards really an environment where sustainable development can be learned, can be acquired through all aspects of the school life. So this is what we're promoting here under the banner of the whole institution approach. And I'll say a little bit about that in a minute with a bit more detail. The third priority action area building capacities of educators, of course, educators at all levels, in universities, at other levels of the education system, are really key for driving educational change, and then via educational change towards sustainable development. So educators, teachers, other learning facilitators really need to be equipped with ESD capacities in their pre-service, in their initial training also, but then also in their continuous training. They need to know, and it also resonates very much with the data we have analyzed that are presented earlier from our teacher survey. They really have to know the facts of sustainable development, but then more importantly, probably they need to be aware of the pedagogies to use, of the approaches to use inside and outside the classroom to really activate students and generate action in their students. We also have found that through a separate piece of research we did, that basically a particularly effective education for sustainable development is really the one that links the classroom teaching with out of classroom activities that have a real connection to the daily life of students, and like this really catches them on their motivation, because they care about sort of what is happening in their daily life and the sustainable development issues in their daily lives. Fourth action area where we're trying to move forward together with partners, like in all the other action areas, is youth, young people, empowering and mobilizing youth. Here, of course, seeing young people not only as recipients of education, but also as those who can drive educational change. And of course, we've seen it very much over the last couple of years through the Fridays for Future movement, who have a very high capacity to really exert political pressure, but who also make it very clear that they have the biggest stake in sustainable development, because they are the ones who really have to live with the world that we leave behind. And they are also the ones who have often very ingenious, creative ideas about how effective education for sustainable development, education to address climate change can happen in and outside of schools. So this is what this fourth area is about. And then finally, really mobilizing education, mobilizing learning processes to generate action at the local level, working with local community stakeholders, with city governments, with universities in the local community, bringing them together in a network and generating a process that leads towards a really whole of society learning environment at the local level. So this is basically the kind of matrix through which we are looking at the action that is necessary in driving education for sustainable development forward. And in a certain way, we can say that all of these action areas have really a strong link to higher education. But in particular, and I will speak about that in a minute, the whole institution approach to ESD, that really in the institution can bring together many different dimensions of education for sustainable development. Very briefly here to mention just like one priority that one activity, one work stream that was a priority for us this year, and that we see also as a kind of important achievement, and that is that throughout this year, really we've seen a number of strong commitments at the global level, at the government level, to enhancing education for sustainable development. So basically we see we organized in May, hosted by the government of Germany, a big conference on education for sustainable development, where we had around 80 ministers really coming together and committing to education for sustainable development, to enhanced education for sustainable development. You can see this here reflected in the outcome document of the conference, that really around 3,000 education stakeholders who participated remotely, and close to 80 ministers committed to the Berlin Declaration on Education for Sustainable Development, with a couple of really very interesting and relevant commitments. For example, making sustainability and climate action really a core curriculum component at all levels of the education system, giving a crucial role to teachers, empowering to teachers at all levels of the education system, fostering intersectoral collaboration, promoting intersectoral collaboration, in particular between the education sector and the environment sector, which is often a very big sort of area that needs to be further developed in countries, and then promoting the whole institution approach to sustainability. Then we can see another event that I just wanted to briefly mention, and that are actually a series of events in the global climate change negotiations, where we could also see that in a conference in Milan, Italy, and then finally at the COP in Glasgow, we saw much more attention to education than compared to previous COPs. So which for us is also a sign really that there's increasing awareness that without mobilizing education, we will not achieve the sustainable development goals. You can see here the photo is an event we organized, a discussion between young people and 6 education ministers from across the world, from all world regions, and who had a really kind of genuine interactive dialogue about how education ministers can fulfill their responsibilities more fully in addressing climate change in their education systems. Here, I'll touch on that only very, very briefly. Sort of here are a few elements that we are addressing when we are implementing this new framework. One particular emphasis is on the country level work that we're doing. Another emphasis is on building partnerships and collaboration at the global level, but also at the national and also at the local and the community level. And that leads me finally to the role of higher education in the implementation of this new framework, the ESD for 2030 framework, or of ESD more generally. I thought it's worth reminding ourselves that even in Agenda 21, really the outcome document of the Big Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, which of course, as you know, is really the first landmark event for sustainable development at the global level. Even here already, we had a very strong recognition of the contribution and responsibility of higher education to drive sustainability forward. So here we had, for example, the call for countries to support universities and other tertiary activities and networks for environmental and development education, run cross-disciplinary courses, something that's coming very, very much to the fore at the moment, where we're becoming more and more aware of the transdisciplinary nature of sustainable development challenges. We have sort of mentions of sort of labor market requirements and the achievement of sustainable livelihoods, and how different levels of the education system, including universities, can contribute to that. A very good kind of also roadmap for higher education we see in a statement a couple of years ago that was an outcome of a big conference run by the International Association of Universities, which is listing like a number of very, very important areas on education for sustainable development, with the whole institution approach again, mainstreaming sustainable development concepts and principles in all fields of study, really, again, this transdisciplinary idea, research on sustainable development issues, community engagement, sort of the university interacting with the local tradition, language, and culture, and also to better blend traditional knowledge in higher education. Also, one very important item when it comes to ESD, sustainable leadership development and practices, transdisciplinary approaches I've mentioned already, greening the campus and sustainability activities really at the campus, and the networking for sustainable development between higher education institutions to consolidate knowledge, experiences, and impact. So when we look at sort of the role of higher education institutions for transformative action, structural changes, promoting the sustainable development goals, all these objectives that I've presented as key for education for sustainable development, we can see that one would be really mainstreaming sustainable development in all fields of study. So to provide the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, not only in some departments that sort of naturally address climate change and other issues, but really throughout all subject areas. That's the same argument we are making, and that the same commitment we are promoting even for other levels of the education system, where sustainability should really be integrated across the whole curriculum. Then universities can also play an important role. Higher education sector can play an important role in promoting transdisciplinary and disruptive approaches, provide opportunities to reflect on individual values, attitudes, behaviors, and lifestyles. Then the issue of community engagement. How can the university really engage with the community, with the local community, by knowledge sharing, critical reflection, and providing inclusive leadership and service to the community. And then, of course, maybe most obviously, research on sustainable development issues that brings insight on how to achieve transformative action for sustainable development. And this leads us back again to something that is very important for ESD, that basically it is all about sort of developing active citizens that can be active really in their local community, but also later as leaders at whichever level on sustainable development. Here I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. You can see here an image about that explains basically that illustrates the whole school approach to sustainability. It's here done, sort of at the level of a primary, secondary school, but of course the same approach, the same image could be created for the university, for a higher education institution, where you can see that that sustainability content is really infused into learning, into teaching and learning. Learning happens in a collaborative way. Learning happens inside and outside the classroom. Learning happens really also through doing. It's just illustrated here through the school garden. Really learning through doing, through experience, through doing yourself something while you are learning, while you are being educated. The whole school or whole institution approach also concerns also, of course, the facilities management, the whole greening of the campus, so that the whole campus can be really an environment where people learn what they live and live what they learn while they are at school, while they are at university. It also concerns the governance of the institution, where the ideas of the participatory ideas of sustainable development should be infused. And then, as I've repeatedly say, the interaction with the community, really going outside of the campus and interacting with those stakeholders that promote sustainable development at the level of the local community. And like this, sort of the whole institution can really play an important role in providing progress towards all sustainable development goals. And finally, still staying with higher education, I wanted to draw your attention to really one very concrete activity, one very concrete initiative that UNESCO is running, and more specifically ESALC, the UNESCO Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, is running a very, very we believe a very, very good, a very kind of worthy ESD initiative at the level of higher education, where we are providing an ESD boot camp, basically an online training, an online boot camp, accompanied by mentoring, accompanied by a lot of collaborative learning for members of the university community to acquire sustainability skills and then be able to infuse them into the work in their institution. You can see here a little bit the timeline. It's really something that is immediately coming up in the first half of the next year. We are running that. My colleagues at the institute, and you can write to me. I will show you the email at the closing slide. Can provide you more information on this really wonderful initiative. If you want to take part, any member, anyone is entitled to express their interest to participate. If you want to take part, the closing date is the 31st of January. 2022. Applications or expressions of interest need to be submitted by a higher education institution and should involve at least an academic, learning designer, or educational developer and a student to really sort of also practice this collaborative approach of sustainability learning through this initiative. So our team must be a maximum of 3 participants, of these 3 different participants. And of course, a certain commitment is required to spend the time required for the boot camp during 12 weeks of the program and to engage in all the specific activities. So I wanted to narrow down my presentation at the end of this very, very concrete activity where we as an organization and specifically our colleagues at the institute are trying to provide sustainability skills for the higher education community. And this brings me to the end of my overview of my presentation. You can see here the email address. If you have any question, you can see here also a few links that provide you with documents that I have mentioned, and also further information. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for the apparently little power outage we had here, but I still hope you could see me throughout my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, for this insightful and very important topic. We have some questions from the audience, if I may. Emiliano Canton asks, regarding environmental justice, my experience when teaching sustainability topics is that a significant portion of students are very disheartened to learn, as they feel none of their actions will matter if big contributions to climate change do not enhance change. How can we address this issue?
I think it's a very, very important question, and we are indeed finding also in our curriculum reviews that environmental justice issues are not really sufficiently integrated in teaching and learning, and I think we can imagine how this can happen, that really sort of curriculum developers and also then teachers sometimes really shy away from these much more controversial issues. And it is true that there can be a disconnect basically between the feeling of empowerment that a student could hopefully generate and really what is happening more sort of at the level of the big political and economic processes. What is key, I think, what is really key is really to start with students, start small, start with local challenges, start with the local community, start also with, and there's also a number of good pedagogical materials out there. For example, on the website of the Environmental Justice Atlas, to look at, start at the local level, look at sort of environmental justice issues at the local level, in the local community, ask students to really investigate those, interview stakeholders, discuss with them, see where the issue is. And like this, they're first acquiring a lot of sustainability skills and a lot of sustainable development knowledge, but should also, when it's connected really sort of to something real in the local community, develop a kind of feeling of empowerment that really manages to counter these kind of sometimes, sort of more bleaker news when we see see when we look at the for example, global climate processes. So that's what my response to this question would be. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. So changing the perspective for future in the students. Thank you very much. So Estela also asked, how can teachers reach those training from action number 3? Are they available as spread options from UNESCO?
Yes, I think we have online. We have online. When you go to the website that you can see here, the first website link that I've listed here, we have online a couple of materials available. We have a specific website that you find through this link here, where we have put together materials for teachers for each of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really, you go there on this website, you check the Sustainable Development Goal, you click the Sustainable Development Goal that you are interested in, climate change, for example, or sustainable consumption and production, and then we take you to training materials where sort of, you can learn more about how to teach this particular Sustainable Development Goal, this particular issue. And of course, there's also a big range of partner organizations that provide platforms. I should mention maybe the SDG Academy, Columbia University's SDG Academy that you can find online, and that has really a wealth of very, very valuable online courses on specific sustainable development issues, and increasingly also specifically on pedagogies, on how to teach them.
Perfect. So everything through the website. Okay, next question, a little bit more in depth. Is capitalist growth environmentally sustainable? What do you consider?
I think that is a very big question. That is really a very big question, and I cannot give the answer to it. What I can tell you is this new framework that I've presented, this new UNESCO framework, really, and you will see when you take a look at the document, gives a very, very big role to sort of inquiring, questioning the economic structures that we have through education. So of course there is an issue there, and I think there is I think across the political spectrum, when we look at the outcome document from the big Glasgow Climate Summit, across the political spectrum, there is a recognition that this drive towards endless growth is really not compatible with sustainable development, especially if it is not disconnected from carbon emissions. And this is something really that is in our current framework, in our current global strategy, we recognize that much more clearly than we did in the past as UNESCO, and I think I can speak also for other partners and other stakeholders, that I think there's no way around addressing explicitly the issue of transformation of the economy, transformation of economic structures to make them more compatible with sustainable development.
Totally agree. I think we need a redefinition of these economic structures. But okay, so next question, Angela asks, how can I generate the interdisciplinary approach within the categories of sustainable development in higher education?
I think that depends very much where you're sitting in higher education, which department you're sitting in. But there are a couple of very good practices out there from universities. Some of them have UNESCO chairs and we work with them. One example that comes to mind, for example, is really like a course, sort of a specific course that all students have to take at the university across all subject areas, and that is taught sort of by teachers from all different departments, and that really addresses sustainable development from the perspective of different subject areas. So I think what needs to be sought, and this emerged, this course, really through a collaborative process at the level of the university. So I think what needs to be generated, what needs to be sought, is really collaborative processes between different departments at the level of the university. Ideally, of course, they would be promoted and put in place by the university leadership, but where that is maybe not the case quite yet, I think there are also possibilities to sort of generate this from the ground up, this collaborative work.
Perfect. So this Congress is one of the best places for this networking or collaboration, as you said. So thank you very much, Mr. Alexander Leicht, for your participation. And we'll see you, everyone from the audience, in a few minutes in our next master event at 13 hours in the keynote panel, Unfinished Business in Education, Reflections for Building the Future of Education. Thank you once again, and see you in a few minutes.